thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you sharing your time and your space and your vulnerability with me. So huge thank you. And just doing a brief introduction, and then we'll go straight into the questions. So Bobi Conn was born in Morehead, Kentucky, and raised in a nearby holler, which for our UK audiences is a small sheltered valley, and where she developed a deep connection with the land and her Appalachian roots. And you managed to obtain, obviously, your bachelor's degree at Berea College, the first school in the American South to integrate racially and to teach men and women in the same classrooms, which is amazing. And you've managed to work five part-time jobs at one point to support your son, which is incredible. And then also attend graduate school where you earned your master's degree in English with an emphasis in creative writing. In the Shadow of the Valley, a memoir, is your first book. So I'm just going to thank you again for coming along to this. And, reading your book, it is really harrowing to read. And I was just wondering, you mentioned your land, the land a lot. And I was just wondering, so what does home mean to you?
I think that childhood is an innately magical experience. Probably psychologists or child development experts have some sort of insight as to why life is so rich as a child, and I'm sure it has something to do with constant discovery and play and relating to the world around us. But that's also, for me at least, I was fortunate to have a home that the outside in the forest and the land itself was just full of beauty, and conversely, the interior of our home was often full of conflict and difficulty. So, I think that a lot of people, to some degree, experience contrast in their home of, the painful things happen there, and then also the beautiful things happen there, and our sense of comfort is there. So, if you do come from a dysfunctional home, that comfort that is also in some ways still present, that creates some real problems, right, in a person's psyche, which I think was a big part of my journey in self-development. So, but ultimately, I still love my home for what it was, for the good that it did give me. And I just think it's, it's a complicated and, hard to define kind of human experience. And I think that's why it's so rewarding to talk about it and write about it and explore it, because it is one of those universal, but incredibly complex aspects of our lives.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I was just wondering, because obviously some parts of the book are obviously really difficult subject matters you were dealing with, and obviously it's extremely personal to you. And I was just wondering, during the writing process, did you feel any level of catharsis talking about it?
Yeah, so I think it might be a little different than what someone might imagine. It didn't feel like, oh, I've got this on the page and now I have some relief from it. It was really, at times, very difficult to write. But of course, I also had to have my reader in mind. And so I couldn't just focus on the emotion or the emotional experience that I felt first and foremost. So that meant that I had to work with the text and work through those experiences on various levels to be able to render them into what was hopefully an interesting and engaging story for others, and not just kind of like an emotional release of my own. So I think what it did, rather than just providing catharsis, I think it forced me to reckon with those experiences over and over as I wrote, rewrote, edited, answered questions from my editor, worked through proofreading, comments, etc. It was like a constant kind of honing my relationship with my story. And there was something really transformative about that, which I think was where writing my memoir ultimately was incredibly empowering. But yeah, I don't think it is exactly like we might think of journaling or keeping a diary or something where maybe we vent and okay, then we can kind of let it go. It was more like a deepening of my understanding rather than being able to separate from it.
That's really interesting. Because I was wondering if some of the process was re-traumatizing in any way, talking about it.
I don't think I was re-traumatized, but I think it certainly brought a lot of trauma to the forefront of my consciousness and made it fresh again, right? But what I believe is that, trauma is always there. We understand more and more how the brain is shaped by trauma, how the body is affected by trauma. And so I think that putting some of those experiences on a page made me, step back into the memories and really be present with my pain. But I don't think the pain had gone anywhere ever. It was always right there. And I'm a big believer in like bringing things to the surface and so that we can deal with it, rather than thinking, oh, that was so long ago, it doesn't matter, or, let's just not think about it or talk about it. I don't think avoiding those painful experiences is very helpful. But yes, it was certainly very difficult at times. And, it was not easy all the time to make the choice to do that.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. And I was just wondering, because obviously there was a lot about sort of your roots in the book. And I was wondering, how did reading sort of the history of the Appalachia that kind of help you understand your own story in this?
Yeah, I think I am still just continually fascinated by the history of the region, the history of my family in particular. I think that, for me, like when I was first exposed to a book that delved into that topic of our regional history, it helped me like reconsider my present reality as not just some matter of fact, but as a result of many decisions and many events. And, it was like there's this entire context that I am part of, and not, we don't just spring out of nothing. So it really just fascinated me and continues to fascinate me to think, how did we get to where we are? What are some of the things that have shaped us or led us to this point? And I think that rather than, some people I believe are concerned that if we look at causation or try to look at history, then we make excuses for present behavior or present circumstances. and just say, oh, it's inevitable because of things that happened in the past. For me, I believe that the more we understand about how we got to a point, whether that's individually or collectively, then the more likely it is that we can determine how we move forward, and what it takes to get to the future point that we want to reach, rather than just being shaped as a result of external forces. Then we can effectively respond to or mitigate or do away with some of the external forces.
Yeah, and it was fascinating to read your history, and actually the fact that you had quite a lot of knowledge of your history in terms of, where your grandfather came from, where your great grandfather came from. It was really fascinating. And also just the aspect of when you were talking about language and linguistics, and you said how you had to sort of change your accent in certain areas. And I was just wondering, how tied up do you think language and linguistics is to your roots?
Oh, I think it's immensely significant. I don't know if people in the UK would be able to differentiate my accent from other accents quite as easily. But here in the US, a lot of people comment that they don't hear my accent.
Yeah, I don't at all. Like, I hear a neutral accent.
Right. And that's, my accent comes and goes depending on who I'm talking to. Because, I think psychologically for me, it's natural or normal to speak as properly as possible, and, to enunciate and do those kinds of things when I'm having a formal conversation or meeting someone for the first time. But if I'm in my hometown or in, little towns around Kentucky, or if I'm with my birth family, and my kids too, and certain friends, the accent just comes, it's front and center. So, and that's a big cultural thing in Appalachia is, here in the US, our accent has historically been the subject of a lot of mockery, and associated with, like, stupid hillbillies, and now probably drug addicts and other negative stereotypes. So of course, you want to protect yourself from ridicule and judgment.
Definitely.
So I think kids today are still trying to figure out how to navigate that as they go into the world away from home.
Yeah, it's definitely very difficult. And I think, yeah, exactly. And that's the problem, isn't it? The connotations that have derived from these areas. And it's, I think, I was just wondering for you, how much do you think like poverty played a big part whilst you were growing up?
So I think for me, as a child, I wasn't able to separate in my mind the pain that I felt internally, that I'm pretty sure I was in constant pain. I was certainly in fear a lot. And, so the child's mind, right, like comes up with reasons for things, even if they're not the logical reasons. So for me, there were a couple of different other kind of external things that I associated with that pain. And one of them was poverty, which I didn't become aware of probably until I was 10 or 11 or so, maybe 9 or 10, something like that. And then the other like external factor that influenced, my reasoning as I tried to make sense of all the pain that I was in and how awful, I say pain, but like, it's shame, it's fear, it's like growing sense of self-loathing, like guilt, just all of those ugly, unfortunate, unpleasant feelings. And so one of my explanations for what was wrong with me in my mind was, oh, I'm poor. We're poor, right? We look poor. We don't fit in. I don't fit in. People make fun of me for my clothing. And then the other aspect of that was religion for me, which, is a whole other topic itself. But yeah, so I think poverty was one of those big external factors that my mind latched onto. And of course, poverty is a very stressful situation often. So the lack of access to resources kind of compounds the the difficulty of pulling oneself out of poverty, or even just being able to have a high quality of life, or a good quality of life. So, I think growing up in the kind of poverty that we were in, it exacerbated the already difficult circumstances, of my father's state of mind, and how he treated our family. And it just made everything a lot harder, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And I was just wondering, like, what do you think are the mental health effects of it, actually, living like that?
Yeah, I read something years ago, and I can't find it now, but there was a study that said that basically they found that children growing up in poverty, they were finding that these children actually had like almost like white noise going on in their minds all the time. And so it was more difficult to focus. It was more difficult for those children to comprehend, analyze, learn. So poverty was, not just like a set of external factors that affect the external reality, but that it kind of affected the way the brain is developing and what the mind is capable of handling. And the same is true, to my knowledge, from what I've read, for adults, and decision-making capabilities. So, I think that poverty, like the fear of, let me back up. Poverty often is correlated with a lot of fear and uncertainty. When are bills going to be paid? Can a bill be paid? What will happen if we lose our home? There's a lot of decisions that have to be made, priorities that have to be set to manage resources when you don't have a lot of resources. So I believe that, poverty for me made childhood this time of overwhelming uncertainty. And, I just never felt like we were, it just never felt like everything was going to be okay. As, I mentioned in my book, like that was kind of this desire I had, was to know everything's going to be okay. And it always seemed like there was a disaster looming over us.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, every child wants to live in safety, isn't it? Some sense of safety and security, which makes total sense when that just sort of feels like it's never really there, isn't it? When you're living through that.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I was just wondering, because I'm like, here is maybe just a little bit better, but in the US, would you say like mental health treatments not very accessible, or is it accessible enough, or in these kind of circumstances, especially in Appalachia?
So at the time that I was growing up, I don't think anybody was talking about mental health. And the idea of someone like my father seeking mental health support would have been kind of laughable, because he was, first a man, and then also functioning to the point of, while dysfunctional, right? He was, I probably can't articulate well the level of functioning that he was at that would have made people dismiss it. I guess people would have looked at him at that time and seen an angry man or a violent man, right. Or maybe someone who did drugs. But they wouldn't have correlated those things with a need for mental health support, right. Because we didn't understand then, the drivers of drug abuse and drug use, or at least some of the drivers. And then we also didn't understand the stressors of poverty and how, people in poverty tend to have higher rates of domestic violence and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, there was very little access then. The pandemic certainly shined a light on how much we need mental health support. And I think a lot of the stigma has been, it's gotten much better. There's not quite as much stigma about needing mental health support.
Yeah.
But the waits, trying to find mental health support now is still really difficult.
Yeah.
And I would say digital access is probably one of the significant improvements. But then again, in a place like Appalachia, both the connectivity isn't always there. And then, people being able to afford internet and right. that sort of thing is also a barrier. So it's like right. we're taking steps forward, but then there's also significant barriers that remain.
Yeah, that's like an infrastructure issue as well, isn't it? Gosh. Yeah. And obviously, I've heard obviously the opioid crisis in America in general is just, it's a different level in the US than it is here. And I was just wondering, how much do you think the pharmaceutical industry are also very responsible for, creating addiction? And, how responsible do you think, say, the opioid crisis is in creating sort of chaos in the region as well?
Well, I don't know if you are familiar with the recent settlement with Purdue Pharma.
Oh, was there a settlement recently?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, I wrote about it. There's an essay on my website that I wrote commenting on it, and I'm trying to be careful about what I say because, of course, you don't want to slander or say anything untrue. But from what I recall of reading the Justice Department's settlement with that pharmaceutical company, they did admit to misrepresenting the usefulness of their drug. A lot of the pharmacy employees or pharmaceutical company employees, there was knowledge of doctors giving out prescriptions wrongfully, and there was a lot of knowledge that the opioids weren't useful for a lot of the treatment that they were being prescribed for, and there was a lot of abuse by doctors and, of course, by people who were selling them on the black market and using them. So, the pharmaceutical company admitted that they were well aware of this, and they stood by and didn't, do anything, and a lot of them profited enormously. So, I do think that pharmaceutical companies bear a great responsibility for what has happened. And I do think that, I think it's possible that we can hold people accountable for their individual actions, but that we, so it doesn't mean that these people were all just victims, right, of the pharmaceutical companies. But on the other hand, we need to be holding organizations accountable for their actions as well, because if they create the circumstances for, really to make it really easy to prey on the weak, or, prey on people who might, for whatever, a variety of socioeconomic reasons, are prone to maybe addiction or drug abuse. It's still not okay to go set up shop in those places and make a bunch of money off of them. So I have a lot of thoughts about that. And they're more, I think, well articulated in the article that I wrote. But I do think there should be some accountability there, and, personal accountability and, corporate accountability, governmental accountability.
Definitely. It sounded like it was like a vicious cycle almost, when I was reading your book, like it was just kind of feeding into the system in some shape or form. But obviously, as you say, there's also, personal responsibility as well. But, and I think you're right about that. And, after everything that happened, I was just wondering, like, how do you build a new home and still have like ties to your roots, even though it was so harmful in so many aspects?
For me, what I had to do was really start working on myself, which I think is a common phrase. And so I'd like to add that what it took for me to improve my life is to take an honest look at the choices that I was making, why I was making them, and then to change my thought processes and to change my belief system so that I could make better choices and I could, recognize what a better choice was and have the psychological and emotional resources to, create something better for myself and for my children. That for me also looked like working with, like, say, a spiritual mentor is probably the best term, who, I shared my concerns with, my life story, etc. And then she worked with me to sort of dive deeply into what were my beliefs, how was my past shaping my present, and then how can I change my beliefs? And it sounds so simple when you say it. It was really harrowing work at times, and a grueling process. And it took years, and I continue to do, different treatment for trauma because I believe I have CPTSD. Sorry, I don't know if that's a common abbreviation everywhere.
Yeah, a complex post-traumatic stress disorder. I can relate. I do have CPTSD as well. So, yeah.
So I've found that neurofeedback therapy is really beneficial as well. And it's just recently that, I think I've gotten to a certain level of healing and well-being that I can I can look at my past and actually be grateful for all of it, and, not want to wish away any aspect of it, because I am able to help others now, and, to share like a really positive message, and a sense of hope with people. And I wouldn't be able to do that if I hadn't experienced that trauma, right? So while I continue to undo some of the effects of the trauma, I am at a point where I can just really love being myself and love my life.
Yeah, actually, that's amazing that you can do that. That's a really massive step forward for your in your healing journey. So and your recovery, definitely. And you start off mentioning the house fire, and I'm wondering, how symbolic this is. But what impact do you think the house fire had for you?
So, when I was growing up, as I mentioned earlier, with the constant sense of uncertainty that poverty brought, one of the things that I heard a lot was that the bank wanted to take our house, and maybe the bank would take our house, and my father would say that he would burn it down before the bank could have it, so it wasn't he who actually burnt it down, but that's why it was burnt down. And, by that point, like, there'd been so much pain take place or occur in that house. And though I loved the land, when I went inside the house, I think I was always afraid for one reason or another, even as a 17-year-old. So when it burned down, I was angry because I felt like it was just such a, like a violent way to, like a violent ending to my home. But on the other hand, I think it was probably the best way for it to, I don't think anybody else needed to live there. I'm glad that I don't have that constant physical reminder of all of those experiences. And I think it's really interesting that my father did what he said he was going to do, which is some kind of tragic, like poetically tragic, that after all of those years of worry and uncertainty, the bank did get the house, and he did burn it down first. And, it's just, I might not be able to describe it, all the feelings that brings up just yet. But it feels really profound, I guess. So thank you. That's a great question. I'll have to work through that a little more to have a better answer.
No, it felt profound. Like, it was mentioned a few times in the book, and I can feel it just sort of punctuated something very significant. A bit like when you mentioned the incident at the beginning with your having to go to your grandma and call her a whore, which obviously is a horrifying thing to do as a child. Because of your father. And so I think there was like certain significant moments from the book that seemed to really stand out. And I'm not sure whether that was kind of your intention or not, but it definitely felt like it punctuated it.
When I started it out with that line, I did really want to kind of set the tone for these like dramatic and very impactful experiences. Now, to me, honestly, I think because I'm still so close to my experiences, I don't gauge them as, I think, as painful as maybe other people do, because I am often like when I've read my story out loud or excerpts from it, there's been times when I am just like focused on the beauty of the creek or the forest, or the words themselves, and I think when people can't relate to the experiences, it hits them harder than it hits me, at least at this point. And it's probably because I'm so familiar with it too, that it's like, oh yeah, this was my life. This was just part of my life, right? And if that's what you grow up knowing, then you think it's normal.
Yeah.
And while I've changed that perspective, it still was, those were my formative experiences. So things like the house being burned down, or the having to go down to my granny's house and call her an awful name, those things still stand out. But it's like, it's against the backdrop of a lot of kind of terrible experiences in between.
Yeah, no, totally. I can totally relate to that as well. Like it just becomes matter of fact when you recount these things, because you've gone through it so many times in your head and had to talk about it so many times as well. So in your head, it's just like, this is a story now. This is the story.
Right. And I didn't quite understand like how other people would receive it until I started sharing it. Like even writing it down, it's like, oh well, this makes a good story. As I mentioned earlier, like my goals were initially to write a good story, because I thought that's what it is, and if I tell it well, then it'll be interesting, and it'll be artful. But then after I started getting some feedback, and reactions to the events, that kind of helped me understand on a new level, like just how dysfunctional it was.
Yeah. It's interesting. And also, I think your experiences of like going to university, which I also found this as well when I was going to sort of a very different aspect or different part of the world, that you're not so familiar with, because I think I had quite a similar background to you in terms of that kind of growing up. And yeah, and then when you said, like you mentioned like how feminism was problematic, because I think, and I was just wondering, what do you think is the effect of sort of lack of intersection of like class and race, and do you feel like that was a problem?
Do you mean a lack of the intersection in my hometown, like growing up?
Yeah, just in terms of, especially, when you had women who were supposed to be helping you, who were sort of deeming themselves feminists, but they weren't very helpful because they didn't really understand the intersection of where you were coming from.
Right. Yeah. I think that is a significant problem that we're still grappling with now. As a lot of people want to solve problems, but if they don't understand the problem from inside of it, then it's, I think, really difficult to be part of the solution. Oh, and it's, I'm not someone who likes to make universal statements like, if someone hasn't experienced poverty, then they shouldn't try to fix, impoverished communities. I wouldn't say that, but I would say that, if someone hasn't experienced poverty and they would like to do something to improve poverty, then they need to probably take a lot of direction from people who have experienced poverty. And the same with, or I guess similarly with feminism. I was just talking about this with a friend earlier today. I think it's really, performative feminism is just much easier than lived feminism.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, I think that, you know, academic and performative feminism are what we see like in social media, and you know, when people are kind of latching onto various events or, you know, like the news of the day and whatnot, and determining how they're going to critique situations or critique people. And I wish I had a good like example to illustrate this right off the top of my head. But basically, you know, I've just interacted with a lot of people who call themselves feminists, who I think fail to understand the like a woman's experience and how, you know, pressures and expectations of women are going to affect behaviors. And you know, when there's a behavior that you don't approve of or you don't like, socially unacceptable or socially not preferred, then, you know, I think understanding what those, in my case, what those women have experienced and what has led them to behave that way is necessary. But, you know, I think that the answer to that too is this greater compassion and understanding in general. And my hope was that by writing my memoir, I would help some people gain a sense of compassion who otherwise might not have it for the people who they see as behaving in unattractive ways or like illogical ways, and usually self-destructive. That's what I've got in mind when I'm talking about these things. So yeah, I wish I could just quickly reference a scene from my book to clarify all of that, because this is a lot of speaking in generalities, but the impact on people's lives is you know, really significant and important.
Definitely. And yeah, just to mention, this was an element in the book, and that's why I've brought this up, because it just seemed so significant where you needed support at time when you needed the most support. Those choices were kind of invalidated. The choices that you had were invalidated. Like, you know, why couldn't you do something else? And it's like, because you had minimal choices. And so yeah, that's why I wanted to bring that up, because I thought that was quite significant generally, because that is something we still see. And, you know, obviously something, you know, we've kind of touched upon is, you know, intergenerational trauma. And I was just wondering, do you feel like, you know, how do you deal with intergenerational trauma? And do you think it can be like inherited?
Yeah, you know, that's something I read a bit about as I was working on this memoir, because of course, you know, thinking about myself in a historical context and a family context, it makes sense to look beyond, you know, what has my father done to me, but then also to say, how did he become who he is? You know, and how did his parents become who they are? Like my grandparents, who I adored. And you know, I think it's really, really important for us to understand that intergenerational trauma, and also the concept of epigenetics came up as I was reading about generational trauma, and how you know, it might actually affect the way our genes behave, which may be passed on, you know, to grandchildren. So, you know, fascinating topic. I think and I'm really excited to see how the research unfolds But I think just from a common sense perspective, we know that, if a person is traumatized and they're running around like with pain or fear or anger that they can't let go of, that's just kind of buried or maybe even on the surface, then there's no way to separate that from the kind of parent that they become. It doesn't mean they'll be abusive, but it means that it's going to be present in that relationship. And for a variety of reasons, it's probably going to have a negative impact on the child. And until someone addresses the trauma and keeps it from being passed on, then, we just keep creating more children who are hurt in some way. So yeah, I think it's a great topic. I think it's of the utmost importance that we understand it and, really start putting an end to those sort of cycles of pain.
Definitely. It's a topic that I definitely want to revisit because it is just so vast, and I think so many people have talked about actually epigenetics, as you mentioned, which is a really fascinating topic for sure. And, and I just wanted to ask on a sort of a more lighter note, you could say, what's next for you anyways? What's your next move after this?
Yeah, thank you. And I hope that, if anyone picks up the book, they'll also be able to see there's light moments in there too. I hope that comes through because, right, life can't be just all pain and seriousness all the time. So I love having some lightness in these conversations. I am actually just wrapping up edits on a novel. Yeah, it will be, I don't have the exact publishing date for it, but it'll come out next year. And it's so funny. It explores generational trauma.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's a historical fiction book, married with a little bit of magical realism. And it's inspired by my great-grandparents. And there's some of the stories that I grew up hearing about them. So I really I grew up hearing more stories about my great-grandfather. And I knew my great-grandmother as a child. And I thought, I wonder what's the rest of her story? And so I was one day said, yeah, I just want to write it. I can't get the real story, but I can write a story and kind of explore what I do know about her and just see what unfolds on the page. And we decided to make it a generational story, so it covers a lot of or several generations. So yeah, that's out or will be coming out, and then I am starting to think about my next book, which we're not 100% settled on the concept yet, so I can't say a whole lot about it, but I'll be working on it here soon. So 2 more books, and yeah, I'm super excited about that.
That's amazing. That's really good to know, and your history is fascinating. So I'll be looking forward to hearing something about your great grandma and great granddad as well, because yeah, they sounded like interesting characters for sure.
Oh yeah, and thank you. Yeah, I'm really hoping people will enjoy the novel a lot.
And also, just so that before we head off, your website, if you could just let us know what your website is so that we can go and see your article, especially on Purdue, that would be interesting.
Sure, yeah. So it's www.bobiconn, just like my name is spelled, .com. So super easy. I guess your viewers will see my name on the podcast information and whatnot. So they should be able to get to that really easily. And there's links to other essays on there, and people can also read an excerpt from the book on there as well. So from the memoir, if they're interested to have a little preview before deciding whether they want to read it or not.
That's perfect. That's great. Yeah. Amazing. Thank you so much, Bobi, for speaking with me. I really appreciate it. And, you know, being vulnerable and open and sharing your stories and your point of view is very important.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me, and I'm really glad we connected.